The Daguang Emperor of the Qing dynasty was famous for one thing above all else. He hated spending money. He wore imperial robes patched with old fabric and slashed palace budgets until his court resembled an austerity program. One morning, he made the simplest possible request: a bowl of street noodle soup, the kind he remembered buying for a few copper coins before he took the throne. The response came the next day, as a formal bureaucratic proposal. To prepare this soup with appropriate imperial dignity, his household staff would need to construct a new kitchen, hire dedicated personnel, and establish a noodle soup management office. At a startup cost of 60,000 taels of silver, plus 15,000 taels annually to maintain operations. 60,000 taels for noodle soup. The emperor suggested the obvious: send a eunuch out the front gate to buy a bowl directly from the stall. A few days later, his staff reported back with solemn regret. The stall had conveniently gone out of business. The most powerful man on earth gave up. He never ate the soup. This was not an isolated case of palace incompetence. The Daguang Emperor was trapped inside a system specifically designed to prevent him from understanding his own economic reality, and that system had been running for generations. The official structure of the Qing court was a masterwork of bureaucratic control. Women ranked in 8 tiers, ounces of pork tracked by auditors, every visit to the emperor's bedchamber logged and timed by eunuchs. That framework governed what every person in the Forbidden City ate, wore, and received. But beneath it, 3 shadow systems operated that held more practical power than any imperial decree. A financial syndicate disguised as a government department, a network of secret marriages among the servant class, and a handful of women who held no formal rank at all, yet controlled emperors from the cradle. The Daguang Emperor had stumbled into the first of these. His household ledgers listed a single chicken egg at 30 taels of silver, a staggering sum when the civilian market price was a few copper coins. But he could not walk outside the palace to verify it, because imperial security protocols meant the emperor rarely, if ever, crossed the outer walls. His entire understanding of economic reality came through reports written by the very people profiting from his ignorance. So he tried an ambush. During a morning audience, he casually asked his Grand Councilor, Cao Jinwang, "How much does an egg cost in your household?" Cao Jinyo understood the trap instantly. He also understood that the eunuchs standing silently in that hall, the ones who managed every gate and every ledger, were listening. Telling the truth would expose the massive financial fraud running through the palace supply chain, and it would make him an enemy of every person who profited from the emperor's blindness. He lied. He told the Son of Heaven that childhood asthma had prevented him from ever eating an egg in his entire life. Palace dramas frame the emperor as the decisive center of all power, the man whose word reshapes fates in an instant. The Daguang Emperor could not get a straight answer about breakfast. The institution everyone was protecting was the Imperial Household Department, Neiwufu. Officially, the Neiwufu managed the daily operations of the Forbidden City. Procurement, construction, food, clothing, everything the inner court required to function. The Qing founders had staffed it with Manchu bannermen, specifically, to prevent the eunuch dictatorships that had destroyed the preceding Ming dynasty. In practice, it became one of the most efficient embezzlement operations in Chinese history. Because the emperor was sealed inside the palace and entirely dependent on their ledgers, Neiwufu officials could set whatever prices they wanted and pocket the difference. That 30-tael egg was not a clerical error. It was the standard operating model. Mundane goods logged in silk-bound books at exponentially inflated costs, the surplus distributed across every link in the chain. The emperor himself wore those painstakingly patched robes without knowing his staff charged the treasury thousands of taels just to sew the patches on. See, the noodle soup proposal makes perfect sense. If the emperor started buying cheap street food, the entire pricing architecture would collapse. That 60,000 tael kitchen was not a real proposal. It was a bureaucratic wall designed to make frugality so expensive the emperor would abandon it. And the system protected itself flawlessly, because every person in the supply chain, from department heads to kitchen workers, took a cut of the inflated budgets. To expose the fraud, The emperor would have to dismantle the very infrastructure that fed, clothed, and physically protected him, a task no sovereign could accomplish without paralyzing his own daily existence. While the Newufu operated its syndicate from above, a different shadow system sustained thousands of lives at the bottom. Young women drafted into the palace and eunuchs castrated into its service shared one overwhelming condition: total severance from the outside world, with no prospect of marriage, children, or ordinary human connection. The official hierarchy gave them a rank and a ration. It gave them nothing resembling a life. Their answer, documented as far back as the Han Dynasty, was a practice called paired eating, dueshir, originally describing partnerships among isolated women who shared meals and emotional sustenance in the vast inner courts. By the Ming Dynasty, the practice had evolved into something far more structured: the paired spouse system, caihu, in which eunuchs and palace maids formed exclusive, long-term pseudo-marriages recognized by the entire servant class as binding, monogamous commitments. These were not casual arrangements. Eunuchs, who typically earned more through bribery networks, assumed the role of husbands, purchasing gifts, arranging better food, and paying off senior eunuchs for private meeting time. Infidelity triggered violent retribution, public shaming, beatings, or total social exile within the servant quarters. By the Wanli era, paired spouse couples walked hand in hand through palace corridors, calling each other husband and wife without fear of punishment, and it was considered a profound social anomaly not to have a partner. The emotional stakes were devastating and real. A eunuch named Song Bao and a palace maid named Wu Shi, a recognized paired spouse couple during the Wanli reign, were torn apart when Wu Shi transferred her affections to another eunuch. Song Bao had no legal recourse because their marriage had never existed in the eyes of the state. He abandoned the palace entirely and fled to become a Buddhist monk. When a maid died, her eunuch partner would purchase a carved spirit tablet inscribed with her name and place it in a Buddhist temple beyond the palace walls. Temples like the Temple of Supreme Bliss, funded by eunuch contributions over generations. On the anniversary of her death, he would leave the Forbidden City, kneel on freezing stone floors, light incense, and perform the ancestral mourning rituals traditionally reserved for a legal husband grieving his wife. The state could track the weight of their charcoal to the fraction of a caddy. It had no ledger for what they actually needed. The third shadow system did not operate among the servant class. It operated directly on the emperor's mind. Because infant princes were systematically separated from their birth mothers, a deliberate policy to prevent consort clans from accumulating political influence. The sole consistent source of physical affection during an emperor's earliest years was his wet nurse. Both the Ming and Qing courts formalized this role, granting wet nurses the title madam, who serves the sage Feng Shengfuren. The designation sounded ceremonial, but the power it conferred was something else entirely: unregulated access to the sovereign's private ear, rooted not in rank but in the deepest bond a child can form. In the early 17th century, a common-born woman named Kushi entered the palace for the biological utility of her breast milk. She nursed the infant who would become the Tianqi emperor, and she grasped, with extraordinary clarity, that the bond forming between them was the most potent weapon in the empire. When the emperor took the throne, Kushi did not retire. She formed an alliance with the eunuch Wei Zhongsen, and together they bypassed the emperor entirely, executing political rivals, dictating state policy, purging scholars by the thousand. A low-born wet nurse and a eunuch functionally ruled the Ming Dynasty until the emperor's death, and her execution came only in 1627, ordered by his successor. Here's the thing: the entire Confucian bureaucracy, tens of thousands of scholar officials, a rank system refined across centuries, an examination apparatus that took a lifetime to navigate, could be overridden by one woman who had nursed the right infant. Kushi used her bond with the emperor to seize political power. Noble consort Wan of the Ming Dynasty used hers for something more primal. She weaponized it to control the succession itself. Having achieved total psychological dominance over the Chenghua emperor, despite never holding the title of empress, she was threatened above all by her lack of a surviving male heir. So she built a surveillance network of loyal eunuchs and palace maids to monitor every woman in the inner court. When pregnancies were detected, her agents intervened, under the guise of routine medical care, to ensure they did not survive. She held the dynasty's future hostage by guaranteeing that no rival's child would live. When a low-ranking female historian named Lady G became pregnant, she was marked for elimination. A gatekeeping eunuch named Jonmin received the order to destroy the newborn. He looked at the child and reportedly said, "The emperor has no sons. How can we abandon him?" Jonmin hid the infant in the Hall of Peaceful Longevity, Anlatong, officially a medical quarantine zone, where sick and dying servants were sent to wait for death. Because the hall was associated with defilement, it fell entirely outside the surveillance network of the court's political elite. The one place noble consort Wan's agents did not watch. Lady G, malnourished and terrified, could barely nurse. Jonmin and his brothers smuggled in a makeshift paste of powder syrup and maltose, feeding the child by hand in total silence. For 6 years, the child's hair was never cut to eliminate any discoverable physical evidence, and by the time he was finally revealed, it dragged across the floor behind him. The revelation came when the Chenghua emperor, mourning his apparent childlessness at age 30, sat before a mirror as Jonmin combed his hair. The eunuch fell to his knees, confessed to a capital crime, and told the emperor his son was alive. The boy was brought forth in a miniature red robe, his tangled hair sweeping the ground. The emperor wept and said, "This is truly my son. He looks very much like me." 6 years in a room meant for the dying, fed on smuggled paste by the men ordered to kill him. Noble consort Wan's monopoly shattered in a single morning. But the Shadow War claimed its final toll. Lady G died shortly after the prince's discovery, under circumstances that have never been adequately explained. Jonmin's own fate splits into 2 irreconcilable accounts. The official state history records that he swallowed gold and died shortly after the revelation, terrified of noble consort Wan's retribution. A family genealogy discovered centuries later tells a completely different story, that the emperor rewarded him with dragon robes and honorary titles, and that his descendants received a commemorative plaque reading "Shrine of Praised Loyalty." That both versions exist, and neither can be fully verified, is itself a product of the shadow hierarchy, a system that erased and rewrote its own history depending on who held the brush next. The hidden prince survived. He became the Hongji Emperor, Juyoten, and in an act utterly without precedent in imperial Chinese history, he refused to draft a single concubine. He maintained a strictly monogamous marriage for the rest of his life, the only emperor in the Ming dynasty ever to do so. Think about what that means. The shadow hierarchy's most violent expression, reproductive warfare conducted behind the walls of the harem, produced the one emperor who rejected the harem altogether. The system broke the man who should have perpetuated it. The official hierarchy, the rank tables, the allowance ledgers, the 8 tiers from empress down to second attendant, was real. It governed what a woman ate, what she wore, how many servants followed her chair, down to the exact caddies of pork and the quality of charcoal allocated to each rank. That machinery has been traced in full. What it measured was precise. What it missed was everything that actually determined who lived, who was erased, and who quietly held the real power. The Qing dynasty studied the Ming's catastrophic collapse and stripped eunuchs of their formal political and military power. The shadow hierarchy adapted. Reproductive warfare gave way to bureaucratized financial fraud. The Neiwufu embezzling through fabricated kitchen budgets rather than commanding armies. The social structures shifted too. Because Qing palace maids were legally discharged at age 25, the lifelong kaihu commitments of the Manira faded into shorter, more transactional survival alliances. The mechanisms changed. The desperation that fueled them never did. Consort Zhen, a favored companion of the Guangxu emperor, had been selling government offices through a network of eunuchs and outer court contacts. When the Empress Dowager Cixi discovered the operation, the punishment bypassed every protocol governing the treatment of imperial noblewomen. Cixi had her flogged with bamboo staffs before the assembled court, a degradation so extreme that the reigning empress collapsed unconscious from witnessing it. In 1900, as foreign armies breached Beijing, Cixi ordered the 24-year-old thrown down a narrow well near the gate of chaste obedience. The Guangxu emperor stood watching. He could do nothing. The Neiwu Fu's financial drain alone, millions of taels, siphoned through inflated ledger entries over generations, left the Qing dynasty unable to finance the military reforms that might have saved it when foreign armies arrived. The shadow hierarchy did not oppose the throne. It grew out of the throne's own design, the deliberate isolation, the enforced deprivation, the systematic severing of every human connection that might have given the emperor an unfiltered view of his own world. The Forbidden City's walls were built to keep the world out. They succeeded so completely that the man inside could not buy a bowl of soup. But the walls also created a closed ecosystem where every need the official system failed to meet, companionship, trust, economic survival, information, was met by an invisible one. The financial fraud, the secret marriages, the wet nurses who outranked ministers were not aberrations in the system. They were the system's actual circulatory network, and the official rank structure was just the skeleton it hung from. The women and eunuchs who navigated this understood something the emperor never could, that the distance between the rules written in vermilion ink and the rules enforced in the corridors after dark was where everything that mattered actually took place. The shadow hierarchy ran on proximity, and no position in the Forbidden City demanded more of it, or carried more danger, than the one nearest the emperor's bed.